Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Mythoscope. Today we're going to be looking at Greece and gods. Dionysus. To the Greeks, wine was an important part of their daily life, of their commerce, culture and even beliefs. Kings would guzzle the drink from goblets crafted from gold. Philosophers discussed their ideas in gatherings where wine and conversation flowed freely, and the merchants sold the drink so quickly and fiercely that Homer would call the Aegean the wine-dark sea. With such a love for the vine and its fruit, it would make sense the Greeks would give it a magnificent origin, and according to their stories, wine was introduced through blood and celebration by the 12th Olympian god Dionysus. He brought the mysteries of the vine in his travels through Greece and India, where he established not only cultivation but also his religion. The rambunctious god is often attributed as the god of the vine, bringer of joy, of fun and freedom. In the same breath, he also represents rage, ferocity and crazed madness, all brought on by the wine he so adores. His description can change from one telling to the next. He can be the wizened old man or a young man that is so beautiful he is considered to be a woman. The vine is his symbol, the leaves worn as a crown upon his head, and he carries with him a staff topped with a pine cone. His mounts are either the leopard or the panther, ferocity and aggression ready at a moment's notice, and you can find him as readily in the open field as you can in the grand theatre. In the pantheon of Greece myths, Dionysus stands firm as the god of contradiction. Before we dive into his stories, I will state this. It is impossible to spend time on every one of his stories. There are hundreds of them, many of which have different variations in each telling. As such, I will focus mostly on the highlights of his adventures, starting with his birth. In the Greek myths, he is the only god to be born from a mortal woman. The story goes that Hera discovered that Zeus was having, like most days, an affair, this time with a mortal woman named Semele. Enraged for the umpteenth time, she went down to the mortal, disguised herself as her handmaiden, and told her that she didn't believe Zeus was truly her lover. "Tell him to show himself to you in all his glory," she said. "I thought he kinda already did that." Semele was swayed, and when Zeus came to her once more, she made him swear to give her anything she asked, without informing him what she exactly wanted. Zeus, eager for another romp, quickly agreed and promised to give her anything she asked for. She told him, and bound by his promise, he went back to the heavens, dressed up in his finest regalia, came back down and turned his mortal lover into a crispy X. But he managed to save the baby and sewed it into his thigh, carrying it to term, and from that, Dionysus was born. Now this is just one of the many versions of the story. Other stories say his mother was either Demeter, Dione or Io. The place of his birth is also a bit of a mystery, which is mostly Thebes but can also be Crete, Naxos and Libya, or even in India. The people of Brasiae have another origin for the god. In their version, Semele and Dionysus were placed in a chest by Cadmus and thrown into the sea. The casket landed on the island of Brasiae. Semele did not survive the journey, and Dionysus was brought up by Inu. The plain of Brasiae was from then on called the Garden of Dionysus, in honor of the god. But the first story is certainly the most popular, and most versions have some of these elements weaved into them. After Dionysus was born, Hera's Zeus infidelity radar went off again, and she discovered Zeus was hiding the child. She promptly tried to kill the baby, but Zeus turned him into a ram to go and live with the nymphs in Naxos, where the young Dionysus would remain for many years. Now once again, the story has a few variations. The one I enjoyed the most was Dionysus was actually born with ram horns and was instead taken by swift Hermes to go and live with Rhea, nurse of lions and the mother of Zeus. Now Dionysus, as I stated before, is the god of the vine, but it is not clear where he actually learned the art. Some say he merely understood it himself, and others believe it was one of his guardians like Rhea, the nymphs, or even the muses who gave him the knowledge of the vine. Wherever he stayed though, he does become restless and decides to travel to spread the mysteries of the vine to the world, his religion essentially, through Asia, Egypt and even to make war against India. One of these travels took him close to the sea, where pirates convinced convinced he was the son of a king, decided to kidnap him and use him for ransom. Smart. Only the captain Nicetas realized the error and told them repeatedly to release the god. They wouldn't listen and tied the rather drunk god to the mast, but the ropes kept untying themselves. When Dionysus came to and realized what the crew was doing though, he turned them all into dolphins or porpoises depending on the story and threw them all into the sea. Only Nicetas was spared and he became one of his most devoted followers. Other versions of the story has the oars turning into serpents, the boat wrapped up in vines, and Dionysus turning into a lion to chase the men off the boat. But the spread of his religion was far from noble. King Lycurgus tried to force Dionysus to leave his land by attacking the god and his companions. Enraged, Dionysus turned the king mad, and Lycurgus killed his son and wife before mutilating himself with an axe by chopping off his legs because he thought he was a tree. Dionysus could be a bit of a dick. Another king, Pentheus, refused to acknowledge the religion of Dionysus as well. The story does vary once again from one telling to another, but it does end up with Pentheus going into the forest to observe the rites and religion after Dionysus had lured most of the women from their homes. When Dionysus spotted the peeping Pentheus, he brought a haze upon the mother and aunts of the king, making them believe he was a wild boar to be killed. The women ran at him, and despite Pentheus's heartfelt pleas for mercy and forgiveness, they grab him by the arms and tear him limb from limb, quite literally. Dionysus was not immune to Eris's arrow at all. Ariadne, daughter of the king Minos, and who helped Theseus to slay the Minotaur, was left on the shores of Naxos. She stood there with a broken heart and was found by Dionysus, who fell in love with her almost instantly, and so took her as his wife. Sadly, a god would always outlive a mortal, and after she passed, he took the crown he had given her and tossed it into the sky to become the constellation of Corana, or Ariadne's crown. But his ultimate goal before ascending to the heavens himself was to spread his religion, which consisted of dancing in the forest and learning the art of the orgy. I am not kidding. That's what it says on the tin. But this is not the orgy you're thinking of. This more or less describes the wanton joy be had when drinking wine, or rather a sort of trance one enters when participating in certain rituals and dancings connected with wine. These orgies were quite common in Greece and included dancing wantonly in the forest, drinking wine obviously, losing oneself in a trance, and even ritualistic castration of priests. Yikes. Dionysus, though, became closely associated with these orgies, as wine does have a very interesting effect on people. It makes you drunk. And it was accepted that the god in the wine was the reason for one's bliss and loss of control. So in his stories, it was sometimes insinuated that he learned the art of the orgy from one caretaker or another. Although his religion grew swiftly, there were few temples built for Dionysus. His followers worshipped him mostly in the forests and fields, because he was so often associated with the growth of the vine. It did translate to other fruit as well, and he soon became a sort of representative for most trees, hence the pine cone-tipped staff. His followers included the sexual nymphs and fauns, Pan, Selene, the raged centaurs, and Mianids, crazed maidens ready to tear you limb from limb. One of the greatest points in his story would be the war he waged against India with Heracles. The two pressed into the border of India as they met resistance for the new religion. He used his army of Pans, satyrs, and women to break through the border. In some stories he also used great siege weapons. After he had conquered India, he taught them the cultivation of the fruit, built monuments, and even built the pillars in India at the end of the world, which is said to hold up the earth and sky. His final act on earth was to retrieve his mother from the god Hades in the underworld. The stories once again alter. One version says he brought both Ariadne and Semele back from the dead, and another believed it was neither, as the wife or lover of a god simply cannot die. But the basic story says after he finds her, he changes her name to Theone, and the two ascend to the heavens, where he becomes one of the great deities in the Greek myths. But why is Dionysus such a contradicting god? As I mentioned with Anubis, polytheism has a tendency to see the growth and change of gods as time passes. Gods in the context of their world need to fill in certain roles, and as cultures grow and people wish to keep their gods, it's simply easier to alter the god a little than to outright create a new one. But there's another possibility. Some historians believe that throughout Europe and Asia, there were more than one deity associated with the wine or the vine. These deities were certainly not as grand or as well known as Dionysus, and as the wine in Greece grew and their influence and religion spread, so too did their gods, and the people simply repeated the most popular name with their stories. Like this idea, and it makes a lot of sense. The idea that other religions had a deity dedicated to wine rings true, and ideas which would be merged into a more powerful cultural would also make sense. And if you look at his earlier incarnations, we can clearly see he had almost none of the attributes he has in later stories. In the beginning, Dionysus was simply a god of wine, nothing more and nothing less. His other name was the drunken god, which is why so many kings didn't want him in their kingdom. Even when Homer wrote about Dionysus, the god was a far cry from being one of the greater deities. This title would only be given much later in his stories, as obviously the popularity of wine grew, and much of his more popular stories do come much later in his mythos. So from all across Europe and Asia, many different gods with many different attributes were given the name Dionysus, and today we have this strange amalgamation of madness and joy. But it is a little fitting, I think, for a god of wine. Alcohol brings out the best and the worst in all of us, and it does make the world as confusing as hell. It's fitting, I suppose, that its god would be just as confused. Love Dionysus? Then look in the links below for more information about the god of wine. And thank you to VX Masterson for requesting this video. Also, if you love myths, then I would really recommend this book, Bullfinch's Mythology. It certainly helped me put together this video, and it is an excellent place to start if you're eager to get into mythology as a whole. Thanks for watching, guys, and have a great week.